Hi, I'm Garrett Ludwig, President of Diversified Design Technologies, with a message alert to all physicians and dentists who are seeking a location for your practice. Do not sign a lease agreement or purchase and sale agreement without consulting with us or another trained healthcare design specialist. We are essentially the CBYD, call before you dig, for pre-planning, design, and development of healthcare facilities. Unfortunately, this is not yet a mandated process, but it should be. This message was inspired by yet another tragic investment that was made by a prospective client. He purchased a suite in a medical office building directly above the ground floor foyer and lobby. As a result, there was no viable access to the floor below his suite to run plumbing and electrical utilities. We offered three viable but costly solutions, which he rejected. So he will now be leasing the suite to another tenant. In the meantime, he's bearing the burden of a mortgage, condo fees, utility service, and taxes, all while searching for another location for his practice. So before I share our approach to establishing the feasibility of the use of a suite for healthcare services, dental in particular, I have to ask this rhetorical question. Would you ever purchase a home without first hiring a professional home inspector to evaluate the structure for any potential hazards or deficiencies before signing a purchase and sale agreement? The obvious answer is, of course not. Why wouldn't you hire a professional to evaluate the feasibility and efficacy of a suite to be leased or purchased for use as a professional office space? In the same context, would you risk the liability and expense for damage caused by penetrating an underground cable or water source when planning an excavation without calling CBYD? It's elementary. Our facility evaluation process for feasibility and efficacy is based on our 40-point checklist, which we have established by bearing witness to countless issues to which our clients or others fell victim to these oversights. To lend some perspective, let me share a dozen of these conditions that are most frequently encountered when we assess a space for economic viability. Space insufficiency. Highest on the list of oversights is space miscalculation and results in space insufficiency. Although it is a simple but tedious effort, it is essential. Measure all your existing space, approximate additional space needed to accommodate expansion and new technologies, add 25% to the total. Why 25%? You will need to accommodate wall thicknesses, passageways, life safety, and other code mandates. Usable versus leasable. The next item, differentiating usable versus leasable space, can readily become a deal breaker even if you've done your homework, since the advertised space includes the thickness of perimeter walls. That is governed by BOMA, Building Owners and Managers Association, and it can result in a substantial undersizing of the needed space. We have experienced losses of as much as 200 square feet in a 3,000 square foot space. So if your calculation of need equates to 3,000 square feet, your needs will not be met in an advertised 3,000 square foot suite, and compromises will have to be made. Demolition. It's critical to determine the status of the space. If it is being offered as is, it means that the cost to demolish the existing framing, lighting, plumbing, and heating and cooling ductwork will become an expense to you as the tenant. We have done projects that cost upwards to $25,000 for demolition alone. The preferred reference in a purchase and sale or lease agreement would be that the space would be delivered clean. Parking. Lack of parking can be two-sided. If the mandated number of parking spaces is not met, it is likely that a building permit would not be awarded. B, it may be necessary to lease a space nearby to accommodate staff parking. We evaluated 8 different spaces in a metropolitan area for a client who insisted on remaining in that city. None met his needs due to, in part, insufficient parking. Utility access. Lack of access to the ceiling below the suite was the obvious inspiration for this podcast. This would typically represent a distinct deal breaker. However, when no other spaces are available, we have addressed the problem. For example, we had a client in Boston who was being evicted from her office by a university that purchased the property for their new dormitories. Having done an exhaustive search over several months for a viable suite, and with a deadline looming, we settled on an otherwise ideal suite in the Back Bay of Boston. Faced with no access to the space below the finished floor, we raised the floor and provided an access ramp. Costly? Yes. Functional? Also yes. Another factor to consider is floor construction. Assuming there's access below, there will be a need to have penetrations in the floor to run the respective utilities. If the floor is concrete, you will need to core drill for each of these access points. They can cost as much as $100 per penetration. For the record, an average dental office will have as many as 30 of these penetrations. Slab on grade. If the subject suite is on the ground floor with no basement, it will be necessary to cut and remove concrete sections to create code-compliant utility runs below the floor. This can add several $1,000s to the construction budget. HVAC. The lease may state that heating and cooling are included in the rent, but it's important to determine if the feed to the suite is independent or fed from a central system. If it is the latter, then the tenant may have no control over the temperature. For example, the owner may change the delivered temperature after 5 p.m. and on weekends. As a result, extended hours or emergency care may be uncomfortable for patients and staff. But there's more. It's important to determine if the heating and cooling is ducted or if the open space above the suspended ceiling, plenum, serves the circulation of air. This will escalate construction costs since the plumbing and wiring will all have to be fire rated. Sensitive tenants. It is critical to determine the occupancy of the floor below your suite, since you will need to access the tenant's space to run your utilities. Work will have to be performed on nights, weekends, regardless of tenant sensitivity. However, if the tenant required high security, such as a bank or facility with medical records, it will also be necessary to hire security for the duration of the work. Nevertheless, labor can be profoundly protracted since time must be allowed to set up, provide labor services, and clean up every day. That often leads to several days of access. Sun angle. The orientation of the building to morning or afternoon sunlight may seem irrelevant, but intense sun can be blinding and might generate unmanageable heat. Shades and window film can help alleviate the stressful and distracting visual effects, and HVAC zoning can diminish the impact of superheated ambient air. However, we have ruled out a space for a tenant due to the observations during an afternoon assessment. The direct western exposure to the afternoon sun was simply too intense to manage functionally and cost effectively. Work letter, or TI. Many prospective clients unknowingly leave money on the table when negotiating a lease. Leading a list is overlooking or not asking for TI, or tenant improvement contribution from the landlord. We have negotiated as much as $53 per square foot from the owner to put toward the fit out of the space. That particular project was 5,000 square feet. So the owner contributed almost $265,000 to the cost of development. Granted, it was in a metropolitan Boston and construction costs are excessive, but it provided a great relief on the client's construction budget. We asked and they delivered, but often the landlord will not offer anything and you must ask. Incompatible services. This is a less common concern, but it carries a hefty price tag when existent. It's therefore essential to ask how the electrical power is delivered to the building. Common voltage in a commercial building is 120/208. However, many commercial buildings are fed with 277/480 to manage larger loads. So what does that mean to you? You will likely have to provide a transformer to convert the voltage. This, like all other costs, must be included in your construction budget. Hazardous materials. We have already identified a potential cost associated with demolition of existing construction materials above, but another potential cost looms in the balance. Abatement of hazardous materials. They could include a variety of materials such as asbestos, paints, and floor tiles. Abatement must be performed by a licensed environmental engineer or contractor at additional expense. In some cases, encapsulation is viable, but there are costs associated with that measure as well. Here's number 13, a baker's dozen. Grace period. Depending on the size of the project, construction can take as much as 120 days to complete. It is therefore critical to negotiate a grace period for lease payments for the duration of the construction. Otherwise, it will be necessary to include the cost of the lease to the construction budget. That could impact everything from finishes to the inclusion of equipment and technologies. To these and other mitigating factors, we say caveat emptor. We have prepared several podcasts that elaborate on these individual issues. Please visit our YouTube page for a more concentrated profile on the value of these insights. Thank you very much for joining us.